Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. I'm thrilled to bring you the 100th episode of Filter. This podcast has been a blast to host, and I hope that all of you in our audience have been helped by it. To celebrate our 100th episode, I am pleased to present this special two-part interview with Nancy Pearcey. Professor Pearcey and I discuss her latest book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. In part one, she shares her story and tells us about her time at L'Abri, including knowing Francis Schaeffer and Os Guinness while she was there. We also cover why she wrote this book and exactly what she's addressing. At the end of part one, she also gives us her critique of the popular book, Jesus and John Wayne, by Kristin Kobes Du Mez. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek and highlighted as one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today. Before we get into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to Filter wherever you get your podcast. Also, if you enjoyed or helped by this episode or any of our other episodes here on Filter, let me please encourage you to share this show with your friends or leave us a rating and review. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and write a review on Apple Podcast. Whenever you take these simple steps, it only takes a minute of your time, but it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into this great conversation that I got to have with Nancy Pearcey. Professor Pearcey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Aaron.
Well, as I was telling you before, it has been one of my goals to have you on the podcast ever since I got it started. Whenever I dreamed about having a podcast one day, you were one of the names that was already on my list to have on. So it is just an honor to get to speak with you today, and I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks for having me. Yes, it's already in our pre-interview discussions, it's obvious we have a lot in common, so this is going to be fun.
Yeah, well, one of those is an appreciation of Francis Schaeffer and his work through his ministry, his writing, and his work at L'Abri in Switzerland. I was telling you before that I've loved Schaeffer for many years now and read a lot of his books, not all of them, but I will one day, and just been greatly impacted by his work in ministry. And so many of the other people that have had a great impact on me, I discovered through his writing, because I started to find who influenced him. And so that's how I found people like Os Guinness, we were talking about a minute ago, and Chuck Colson, and your writing, Doug Groothuis. And so anyway, you got to, well, how about you tell us your story of living all over the world and then eventually making your way to L'Abri and becoming a Christian there, and just telling us what L'Abri was like, what Schaeffer was like, and tell us about that.
Yeah, L'Abri is French for the shelter, and it was the name of Francis Schaeffer's ministry, which was largely apologetics. You know, it was answering intellectual questions that young people had, and I ended up there because I was raised in a Lutheran home, but it was a very ethnic home. My parents were Scandinavian. My mom's Norwegian, my dad's Swedish. So it's a little bit like, all Italians are Catholic. So all Scandinavians are Lutheran. And so there was not, I would say there was not a lot of real fervid commitment in my family. And so when I was in high school, about halfway through high school, I started asking questions. I just started asking, how do we know it's true? I'm attending a public high school, so all my textbooks are secular, all my teachers are secular, and I just start wondering, how do we know Christianity is true? And unfortunately, nobody in my life could answer that question. I asked a university professor, point blank, why are you Christian? He said, works for me. I said, you're a university professor and that's all you've got? And I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it was a psychological phase that I would just outgrow. And so about halfway through high school, I decided maybe Christianity just didn't have any answers. And I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing and started on a very conscious search for truth. I decided it was up to me to find out. My goal was to survey all the religions and philosophies of the world and decide which one was true. And actually, that's how I started studying philosophy. I walked down the hallway to the library at the public high school I attended and started pulling books off the philosophy shelf because I thought, wow, if I can't find any adults to talk to me about this, isn't that the job of the philosophers to answer questions like, what is truth and how do we know it? And is there a meaning to life? And is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you? And I very quickly concluded that if there was no God, then the answer to all those questions was no. There's not a meaning to life. There's not a foundation for ethics. And I realized there was not even a foundation for knowledge. And what I mean by that is I thought, well, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of space-time history, then what makes me think I could have some sort of transcendent, universal, absolute truth? Ridiculous. And that's how I thought of it as a 16-year-old. Ridiculous. So by the time I graduated from high school, I was already a very confirmed relativist, skeptic, even determinist, because my science classes taught me we were just complex machines anyway, operating by natural forces. So it was a couple of years later that I ended up at L'Abri in Switzerland. We had lived overseas when I was a child, and so I had gone back to Germany. And I ended up at L'Abri, which is in Switzerland, and that was the first time I'd ever encountered any Christians who talked about apologetics, who showed that there could be good reasons, arguments, evidence, who could engage with the secular isms that I had absorbed by that time. Mm-hmm. And I was blown away. I was shocked. I had no idea that there were Christians who could engage with these kinds of philosophical, intellectual questions. In fact, I was so blown away that I left after a month. In other words, I was afraid of being drawn in emotionally. It was so attractive. Not only were they answering the intellectual questions, which is the most important thing, but they also, Schaeffer was known for endorsing the arts, right? I mean, that's the term cultural apologetics was coined to describe what he did, because he looked at how ideas percolate down through cultural forms like literature and music and movies and art. Yeah. And I was studying violin. I was studying violin at the conservatory in Heidelberg, Germany. So the fact that he cared about the arts was really big for me. And many people who were there said it was also the quality of Christian community that was almost as impressive as the apologetics. In other words, we saw a form of community and love and Christian love that we'd never experienced back home. And so the upshot was I felt very emotionally drawn, and I did not want to become a Christian on emotional reasons, because Christianity had already let me down once. And so I was not going to come back unless I was intellectually convinced it was true. So I left L'Abri and just continued studying apologetics until I was convinced. And a year and a half later, I went back to L'Abri. And that's where I stayed for 5 months and became, was it 4 months? 4 months plus the 1 month earlier is 5 months. That's where I really got grounded in Christian worldview. And if you read my books, you'll see they all reflect in some way the influence of Schaeffer's thinking, though I try to take it further, expand it, apply it for our own day. Mm-hmm. But that was it is the reason I became a Christian. So I can't say I became a Christian at L'Abri, because it was actually in between my two trips. Mm-hmm. But it was definitely because of L'Abri that I became a Christian.
Yeah. So how did L'Abri work? What was an average day like over there? How was the teaching done and the life done together over there?
Yeah, so it started very organically. Nobody said, hey, let's have a residential ministry where we have people come live. Instead, it started out with when Schaeffer's three daughters were old enough to go down the mountain, right there in the Swiss Alps, to go down the mountain to the Lausanne University. they would talk to their friends, and their friends would have questions about God. And they would say, hey, you need to talk, you should talk to my dad. He's really good with those kinds of questions. And so they would take that little train up the mountain. You've seen those pictures of the trains that go up the Swiss Alps. And because it was so inaccessible, they would generally spend the weekend. And then they would tell their friends, and new students would come up the next weekend. And then other students would come up the next weekend. And pretty soon, the Schaeffers had people sleeping on their couches and their hallways and their balconies, and it sort of morphed very organically into a residential ministry, as people who often who had been converted at L'Abri would say, well, we'd like to join this ministry, so they would buy the chalet down the street. I say chalet because that's the kind of houses people live in the Swiss Alps. It sounds like a luxury home, but it's not. It's just what they live. Farmers live in chalets. So they would buy the chalet down the street, and eventually L'Abri was, it's just a group of homes scattered through a little Swiss farming village. And you would live with a Christian family and actually, participate in the daily chores. So you'd study, it eventually developed where you'd study half a day and you'd participate in the daily chores for half a day. So you really were a member of the community. And many nations, you may know this, it's very common that they have a 3-month tourist visa. And so what happened is a lot of people would come there and they'd spend their 3 months and then leave. So it's almost like a semester abroad. So it was, but the emphasis was always on, yes, you're here to study, but you're also here to actually see what Christian community looks like. And you probably have read Schaeffer's book, Love is the Final Apologetic. The Mark of the Christian is the title. And he argues there that love is the final apologetic. And that was really an important part as well, that you live with a Christian family. In other words, Schaeffer wasn't just a talking head, who came in and spoke at a conference behind a lectern and then, jets off back to Switzerland. He was somebody that you saw day in and day out, and how he interacted with his own family and with the students and so on. So it really was a very holistic kind of witness.
Yeah. And what was Schaeffer like?
Since being at L'Abri, I have worked in other ministries and obviously since becoming a Christian. And I have to tell you, over the years, I've actually come to appreciate Schaeffer more. He was the real deal. That's how my husband puts it. He says, he was the real deal. He was authentic. He couldn't hide anything because you're living in his home. Right? So I would say he was probably the most authentic person that I've known in terms of like somebody who was in Christian ministry and well known. He was warm, he was personable, he was easy to talk to. He was overtly caring about people. He was that kind of a person. I also went to a L'Abri conference once after I'd come back to the States, and somebody asked him, do you consider yourself a philosopher or a theologian? And he said, I'm an evangelist. And I thought, that's it. That captures it. He really was an evangelist at heart, that he had a passion for helping people find God, connect to God. And that I thought that captured well his true heart.
Yeah. And before we move on from that stage of life, we were talking before, and I shared with you a frequent guest on our show has been Os Guinness, and he's also one who's had a major impact on my life. And you got to be there at the same time as him. I've talked to him before about L'Abri and all. And so, what was Os like as a young man?
Well, you're going to have him on your show again, so I better be careful. No, we were all very impressed with Os. So the first time I was at L'Abri, Os was still single, and he was one of the lecturers. And when I went back the second time, he was married to Jenny, and was still one of the lecturers. But we were all very impressed with Os because he was one of the better lecturers there. Schaeffer would lecture regularly. Schaeffer would also hold Saturday night discussions that was kind of a regular thing. And then there were a couple of staff members who were regular lecturers. Everyone loved it when Oz was the lecturer because he was so good at it. And he, well, of course, we all loved his British accent too.
Yeah.
But he would. I'm remembering, for example, after all this time, I am still remembering how he would talk about how every secularism, rationalism, materialism, empiricism, all have some core truth because we're all made in God's image and we all have to live in God's world, and so we all discover some truth. And he talked about existentialism in particular, and he said Christianity should be the best form of existentialism, just like it is the best empiricism, because God made our five senses, and so in order to interact with the world that He made, so of course we value the empirical realm. Empirical science got its start in many ways from Christianity. Because of that, I mean, like ancient Greeks didn't value the senses. Plato and Aristotle didn't value the senses. That was not an adequate, reliable form of knowledge. So it was Christianity that said, yes, we trust our senses because God made them that way. Made us with our senses to know the world. Anyway, we should be the best rationalist because, Jesus is the Logos. We should be the best naturalist because nature was made by God and we respect it. And anyway, that night he was focusing on existentialism, and I raised my hand. I was not a Christian yet. This was the first time I was at L'Abri, and so I raised my hand and I said, "What do you mean? What do you mean Christians should be the best existentialist?" And so he talked about this sort of day by day walk with God. How as Christians we don't just believe an abstract intellectual system, but it's a living daily experience as we make our decisions, because existentialism focuses on how we make our decisions day by day. In a sense, we create our life through the decisions we make. And, well, that's a very Christian insight. We do, in fact, in a sense, create our life by day-to-day decisions that we make based on God's revelation, based on God's presence in our life. And there are times when we don't know what's... Scripture gives general principles, but there are times when we don't really know what God's will is for this particular point, or what the right thing to do is. And so in that sense, the sort of existential reality of day-by-day decision-making, day-by-day living, Christians should be... So he was he was being provocative, of course, we should be the best existentialist. But his point was that we do, in fact, have to trust God moment by moment. It's not just a one-shot deal. Okay, I became a Christian, now I live under my own, rational understanding. No, moment by moment, we have to be making decisions based on God's truth.
Wow. Well, I could ask for more and more questions, but we do have other topics that we're going to be talking about today. And so, but thank you for sharing about your experiences there and what it was like. Because, it's great to hear. But today we're talking about your new book that is, as of our recording, hasn't come out yet, but will be coming out soon, called The Toxic War on Masculinity. And so just to kick off the conversation about this, why did you decide to write a book about masculinity in our culture?
Well, for starters, of course, it's very obvious that men are being attacked in our culture in the sense of, masculinity itself being demeaned as harmful and toxic and dangerous. It was very easy to start the book with several provocative quotes. The Washington Post had an article called "Why Can't We Hate Men?" Wait a minute. To say something so bluntly in a respected mainstream publication, this is no longer on the fringe, the feminist fringe. This is now mainstream that you can just attack men. Or the Huffington Post said her New Year's resolution was to kill all men. Or you can buy T-shirts now that say things like, so many men, so little ammunition. Books have come out with titles like No Good Men, I Hate Men, and Are Men Necessary? So no wonder, this is a stat that just came out, by the way, for International Women's Day. A statistic came out in Britain. 55% of men say that, and let me read it to you. It says, society has gone so far in promoting women's rights that it is now discriminating against men. 55% of men say that. That's, whether you agree or not, that's a lot of men. Mm-hmm. And actually, what surprised me even more, though, was that men themselves have kind of jumped on the bandwagon. I was able to find quotes. Let me see. You may have seen this one because it was not that long ago. The director of the movie Avatar wrote, "Testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system." Or it's a best-selling science fiction writer, Hugh Howey. Testosterone is the problem. Women should be in charge of everything. Or a book by a man saying, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. So I was astonished to find even men saying, denigrating their own sex. So clearly one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book is that I wanted to say, where is this coming from? Where's this incredibly negative view of masculinity coming from? How can we explain it? How can we respond to it? But the final trigger, actually, in deciding to write the book was when I saw how much Christian men are kind of treated as Exhibit A. The main example of toxicity is said to be Christian men. Evangelical men, and anyone who's theologically conservative and who believes in some sort of male headship in the home. And that was easy to find too. I found both secular and Christian people. Let me read you a couple of these quotes. Conservative Protestant gender ideology can clearly lead to abuse, both physical and emotional. Or another quote, it's no secret that abuse is prevalent in conservative churches that embrace headship theory. A theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So I thought, okay, wow, it's not just a problem in our culture, it's probably exacerbated even in Christian culture, that Christian men are treated as the worst examples of patriarchy and oppression to women and abuse and control and so on. And then I read the sociological data and found out that was none of it was true. So this is why I just had to write the book, because it's hidden away in the academic literature and it's not getting out. But the sociologists looked at these charges and said, well, where's your evidence? You're making all these charges. Where's your evidence? And so they started doing studies, and I quote, I think about a dozen sociologists who've been doing work on this. My go-to one, the one who's done the largest study, is Brad Wilcox, who teaches at the University of Virginia and is head of the Institute for Family Studies. So I'll quote him in particular, but he says, okay, where are the studies? Where's the evidence? Where's the data? Well, it turns out that sociologists have been finding for the last few decades that evangelical Christian men who are really, authentically committed to their Christian faith, who attend church regularly, actually test out as being the most loving to their wives. By the way, they do interview the wives separately, which is important. Their wives themselves report being the happiest with their husband's expressions of love and affection. They're the most engaged with their children, both in terms of shared activities like sports or church youth group, as well as discipline like setting bedtime, setting limits on screen time. And they have the lowest level of divorce and the lowest level of domestic violence of any group in America. So the sociological facts totally debunk the charges against Christian men. And even Christians don't know this. Christians are not tuned in to the sociological data. And so I said, okay, I have to get this out.
Yeah.
I have to get this information out so that Christian men know that, in fact, they are doing very well. Let me give you a quote from Brad Wilcox. He's my top sociologist. He was, yes, here it is. It's in my notes here. So he wrote an article in the New York Times, of all places. So when I say Brad Wilcox, you need to know that he's considered maybe the top marriage sociologist in the nation. And he does get articles into the New York Times and the Washington Post and Slate and so on. So this was in the New York Times. It was for Valentine's Day, and a progressive writer had written in saying, "Oh, progressive marriages are much happier." And so he wrote a response. And they published it, and he said, you're right. Progressive marriages are happier than average because they are more intentional. Right? They are trying harder. But he said, let me show you my evangelicals. It's kind of a J curve. Let me show you my evangelicals. They test out much better than even progressive secular people. And here's how he puts it. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So the happiest wives in all America. But the reason they're testing the wives in particular, of course, is the accusation that these men are abusive, and that they're chauvinistic, insensitive patriarchs, that they're oppressive, that they disempower their wives, that they're abusive, and so on. So it's very important that they say, well, what are the wives reporting? Fully 73% of the wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services with their husbands actually are the happiest of all wives in America. Now, again, a lot of evangelicals are not reading the New York Times, so we miss this. This is the main reason I wrote the book. I really wanted to encourage Christian men and women, Christian marriages. They actually are doing very well by comparison with the rest of society. In fact, here's how Brad Wilcox ends. He has a whole book on the subject, and here's how he ends it. He says, because he's so widely known, a lot of secular people read his stuff, and they're like, well, wait a minute, you're saying church has this impact? I even had a secular friend who was very skeptical of these findings. She said, well, maybe it's not that Christian men are better. Maybe it's that better men are attracted to church. To which I said, yeah, well, then what is it about church that attracts good men? You still don't win. But but Brad Wilcox said it's kind of funny watching him. As a Christian, you're watching him explain to secular people. Actually, church does do some good.
Yeah.
And he says, actually, listen. Here's how it works. Church going does actually expose men to messages telling them that the family was created by God. It's not some evolutionary accident. It's not just a cultural construct. Church tells men that they are accountable to God for how they treat their family. Here's how he puts it. Let's face it, it's one of the few institutions in the United States where men encounter other men who are interested in talking about fatherhood and marriage, and in encouraging one another to do better. You don't find it at work. You don't find it in sports. You don't find it at the local tavern. But in church, and this is a direct quote, in church what you do find is a message and an ethos that is family-focused and gives men the motivation to attend to their families. And he concludes, talking again to secular academics, secular academics need to cast aside their prejudices. I love that. Cast aside their prejudices, that is, their prejudices against evangelicals. About religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Theologically conservative family men are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So this is great news.
Yeah.
And like I said, we don't really know this because when I give this information, I often get pushback, even in Christian circles, by people who say, well, wait a minute, haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of society? Right? Haven't you heard that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the researchers went back to the data, and what they did is they divided out the men I've been talking about, which are the truly committed, authentically devout Christian men who attend church regularly, versus nominal Christian men. So I used this phrase in my classroom the other day, and people didn't even know the term nominal. Technically it means in name only. Nom is Latin for name. Nominal means in name only. So these are Christians who, in these surveys, they might check the Baptist box because they live in Georgia. They live in a culture that's more culturally Christian, or their family background, but they actually don't attend church very often, if at all.
Yeah.
The numbers were stunning. They were shockingly different. Nominal Christian men have the worst marriages. In other words, their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest level of divorce, higher than secular men. And they have the highest level of domestic violence, higher than secular men. So if you put these two groups together and just measure evangelicals, you're going to get skewed statistics.
Yeah.
That's why we haven't figured this out before. You have to unpack truly committed Christians from nominal Christians. Because the nominal Christians are skewing the statistics. They're ruining the reputation for everyone else, for all the rest of the Christians. And here, let me quote Brad Wilcox again, because he wrote about this in the magazine Christianity Today. And he said, the most violent husbands in America, with the italicized, that's his writing, he italicized the most violent husbands in America, a Protestant evangelical men who attend church rarely or not at all. So this is what we're up against, like in our churches, is that we need to recognize that there are men hanging around the fringes of the Christian church who hang around enough to pick up language like headship and submission, but not enough to pick up the biblical meaning of those terms, and who infuse those terms with secular concepts of domination and entitlement and control and so on, and who end up, as a result, even worse than secular men, according to the surveys. So that's what we're up against in terms of churches. We need to figure out how we're going to address these men who are out there in public identifying as Christian, identifying even as evangelical, but who are living worse than secular men. Yeah.
Yeah, you spent the first section of the book going through all this data and arguing against those common sense assumptions and false narratives that there are out there in the culture, and I really enjoyed getting to read that and hear it, because I think that a lot of committed evangelicals anecdotally know that those narratives aren't true, because we've witnessed it and experienced it in our own life, that it's not true that, our marriages aren't perfect, but we have happy, healthy marriages. And, I've even, I was reflecting on like my closest friends, my best friends, and they're all the kind of men who demographically would perfectly fall in the category that supposedly should be domineering and abusive and so on. They're all, masculine men and hold traditional values and believe in Christian male headship and so on, but have happy marriages and happy wives, and they are so involved with their children's lives and involved in caring for the children and teaching the children and playing with the children and caring for their wives and in honoring their wives' desires and their wives' voice and so on. And so, I was thinking how I know there's so many other people like me who anecdotally, from their life, from their friends, they've witnessed this evidence. But then it's just hard to argue against these giant publications and the power of the mainstream media that's pumping out a false narrative that goes against what's our anecdotal experience.
The only thing I would say is, because you and I hang out with mostly committed Christian men, I always thought the nominal Christian men would be a small group, because I don't know very many of them. Mm-hmm. Actually, according to one study, they're the same size. There are just as many nominals as committed. What that means is, when the average secular person meets somebody who identifies as an evangelical Christian, they have a 50-50 chance that that's a nominal Christian.
Yeah.
And that's why. So I think that's why so many secular people do get the wrong idea.
Yeah. But I was even speaking of Christians, of committed Christians who, even though we know experientially it's not the case, still absorb what our culture says Christian men are actually like.
Right. Well, we often hear that Christians divorce at the same rate as others. In fact, I read that this is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders, and I'm guessing they're just trying to motivate us by negative, but when you motivate someone negatively. So Christian leaders do use that statistic a lot. And they need to go back to the drawing board and rethink, look at the actual data, because that data came out of studies that did not separate the nominals from the really committed Christians. Yeah.
Yeah, I think after reading that first section of your book, I realized how, this is the perspective that we need to have in our churches on our own men and then treat them appropriately, because I think that because like I said, there's a lot of Christians and church leaders and authors who are believing and absorbing the hostile culture's message. And there's another new book that just came out, which is about addressing the toxic masculinity in Christian men, written by a Christian author through a Christian publisher. And the main endorsement said, toxic masculinity is rampant in the church, and this book is going to address it. And I thought, you're just playing right into their hand by absorbing their narrative. And then that leads to turning men away because you're telling them, well, just your nature itself is toxic. And it leads to either ignoring men, it leads to very harsh treatment against men. The classic examples of on Mother's Day, the mothers are brought in and told how sweet and wonderful and perfect they are and amazing they are and how we couldn't do without them. But on Father's Day, we yell at them.
Do better. You need to do better.
Yeah, instead of treating them with similar respect and trying to encourage them and push them on and doing good work. So I think it's important which script we believe.
I don't name names in my book, but I have written the book partly to respond to the kind of books you just mentioned. The books by even Christian authors who accuse Christian men of toxic masculinity, and I'm like, guys, you're not keeping up with the social science. That's my response to them. You're not keeping up with the social science. Just like I mentioned Brad Wilcox as the main marriage sociologist. When I first read him and he said, where's the data? Where's the evidence? I thought, that's right. Nobody's asking that. And so even Christian books are coming out, which are not informed by the data, by the actual research of the sociologists, the social scientists. Now, I admit I had to go hunting for it. You have to look for it. It's not going to just fall in your lap. I had to go into sociological journals, academic literature to find a lot of the studies that I quote in my book. But that's, anyone who's going to pronounce on this publicly should be doing that kind of research.
Yeah.
And it's just so encouraging. Like I said, I didn't name names, but I have them in mind. I have those kind of books in mind as I'm writing this, hoping that this will help counter that message, that negative message.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind, I'll name a name. There's, the most famous one that I can think of recently would be the book called Jesus and John Wayne by, I can't remember her first name, but Du Mez. It's her last name, I believe. And, wildly popular, endorsed by major Christian publications. And I think definitely absorbing a view that's different from your book. How do you respond to, other than writing your book, like what is your response and critique of a book like Jesus and John Wayne?
Well, of course I had to read it as part of my research. I have to read whatever's out there. And I chose not to even mention it because I think it's, I didn't want to draw more attention to it, frankly. I did not want to draw more attention to it by even critiquing it. So I didn't. But there's a couple of things I would say. Number one, her definition of evangelical. She does not even treat it as a theological position. She says point blank in the book, evangelical now means a political interest group. So as a result, in my book, I had to actually explain, no, I'm treating it as a theological position. I had students who did the same thing. When I use the word evangelical, I teach at a Christian college, Houston Christian University. It was Houston Baptist until recently, but now it's Houston Christian University. And even among my students, they said, "Oh, I've never heard evangelical used in any but a negative sense." Really? So, in my book, I do have to say, okay, because this word has been politicized, I need to clarify that I'm using it in a theological sense, and historians of church history usually often refer to David Bebbington's definition. He's a British church historian, and he has 4 points. You believe that. Well, I won't go through it. You know what the evangelical means, but it means people who. What Schaeffer used to say was Bible believing. That was his way. There's the liberals and there's the Bible believing Christians. So I had to pretty much explain. I mean those Bible believing Christians. So first of all, I would take issue with just her very definition of what evangelical is. And secondly, I agree with you. She doesn't seem to be hanging out with the men you and I know, because it seemed like every page was full of accusations of patriarchal, white supremacy, abusive, oppressive. And the only thing I kept thinking is, you're not paying attention to the data. You're not paying attention to the social sciences. Sociologists and psychologists who've actually been doing research. And it's gone back. I think, I was trying to think, I admit it's not that far back. It's like to the mid-'80s or so. I think some of my earliest studies went back to the mid-'80s. So from roughly the mid-'80s, mid-'90s, 1990s, there have been Christian psychologists and sociologists who have been asking this very question, and just look at all my footnotes and you'll find them all. They have been asking, well, what a Christian marriage is like, what are Christian men and women like, what are their families like? There've been dozens, I would say about a dozen, that I researched that have been done over the decades, showing that Christian men are actually much more family-oriented, much more oriented toward their marriage than the average. And so, and the only difference is, I did run into a few that were more negative, but again, they were not making the distinction between committed and nominal. If you don't make that distinction, you might get worse statistics. And I saw a few of those kinds of studies where they said, oh, Christian men, they're more likely to abuse and so on. But that's because they didn't make that distinction. So that's my main response is define evangelical better and look at what the social science data is actually showing.
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously one of the things that she's arguing, and it's right there in the title of the book, is that what we've defined as Christian masculinity is due more to cultural stereotypes than anything biblical. And I know that I haven't read the book, but I've listened to her on podcasts, and I know that she argues that much of our current understanding of what masculinity is traces back to Cold War attitudes, and in your book you go much deeper in history to look at how we viewed masculinity and so on. Yeah, so I don't want to say anything else about her book, but so tell us about the history of of what masculinity meant and how it changed from earlier history through the Reformation, colonial era, and then you spent a lot of time talking about how the Industrial Revolution changed family life, and then through this massive change came a difference in understanding the role of men and masculinity.
Thanks for joining us for part 1 of this conversation with Nancy Pearcey. Return for part 2 next week to hear the rest of her critique of Jesus and John Wayne, as well as more topics on the toxic war on masculinity. Remember to subscribe to Filter so that you don't miss out on any future episodes, including the next one. Also, leave us a review. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch up the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the